guys. Tonight we're leaving behind the soft glow of your bedside lamp and stepping into a world where forgotten streets lie silent beneath layers of dust, stone, and centuries. You're going to walk roads that don't exist on modern maps, pass through gates no living soul has guarded for 1,000 years, and slip between walls that once echoed with voices now vanished into time. It's the kind of night where even the stars feel like they're holding secrets they won't share. You can almost hear the hush of crumbling marble and the breath of ancient winds winding through empty corridors. It's beautiful. And let's be honest, just the tiniest bit unsettling. Because let's face it, you probably won't survive this if you actually went wandering through half the places we're about to explore. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop me a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, the sound of your footsteps muffled on a path that seems carved straight from a dream. Dust drifts around your ankles like pale ghost mist, catching moonlight in tiny sparks. As you look up, a stone gate towers above you, half buried in ivy and secrets. Tonight is all about whispers, the whispers of lost cities calling your name. And it's funny how these places keep hiding from us. Historians still argue whether some cities even existed at all, or if they're just myths woven to fill gaps in dusty scrolls. But myth or not, the human brain loves a good mystery. A forgotten city? That's like catnip for our curiosity. Take Atlantis, for instance. A city supposedly glittering beneath the ocean waves, with golden temples and streets of silver. Sure, Plato might have made the whole thing up. Or maybe the Atlantic still hides marble pillars and coral-crusted doorways waiting to be found. The mainstream fact is this. Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BCE as a moral allegory. The quirky tidbit? Some fringe researchers think satellite images show grid patterns on the ocean floor near the Azores. Historians still argue whether those grids are geological formations or remnants of some lost civilization. But Atlantis is just the tip of the submerged iceberg. Because scattered across deserts, jungles, mountain valleys, and ocean beds lie countless other cities that once thrummed with life. People cooked dinner, haggled over prices, fell in love, and dreamed their own dreams there. Just like you. And now, their cities stand empty. Imagine the hush of a vast marketplace, where traders once shouted prices over baskets of dates and spices. Now it's only the wind threading through arches and carrying the faint scent of old stone. You run your fingers along a wall etched with carvings, the figures half erased by rain and time. And you can't help wondering, what happened? Why did the people leave? Of course, sometimes cities die quick with earthquakes, floods, or volcanic tantrums swallowing them overnight. Other times, it's politics, trade routes shifting, or a ruler who suddenly becomes about as popular as a sandstorm in a pottery shop. A lot of folks assume forgotten cities are all about ancient times. But even modern places can vanish. Did you know the entire town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, had to be evacuated because of an underground mine fire still burning today? Talk about a hot housing market. But tonight, we're going deeper. We'll uncover cities sunken beneath oceans, buried under deserts, or hidden in jungles thick enough to swallow pyramids whole. We'll explore grand halls and secret passages, learn about royal intrigue, forgotten rituals, and the tiny human moments lost to time. It's not just the big names like Pompeii or Atlantis. There are places whose names you've probably never heard. Their stories might be carved in stone somewhere, waiting for a curious traveler or a sleepy listener like you to stumble across them. So keep your eyes open, even if they're fluttering closed, because the forgotten cities of the world are out there, waiting. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to rediscover them. Just hopefully not by falling into a sinkhole. That'd be one heck of a wake-up call. You keep walking, and the dusty road beneath your feet slowly dissolves into cool water lapping at your ankles. Before you know it, you're drifting weightless through a sea so impossibly clear, it's like swimming through liquid glass. Shafts of sunlight pierce the surface, shimmering over white sand and something else, a faint outline of columns and walls far below. Here, the whispers get louder. They keep murmuring the same word, Atlantis. It's funny how one city has managed to haunt human imaginations for over 2,000 years. Historians still argue whether Atlantis was ever meant to be taken literally, or if Plato was just writing a philosophical parable after one too many cups of wine. The mainstream fact is that Plato first described Atlantis in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BCE, claiming it was a powerful naval civilization that vanished beneath the waves in a single day and night. But the quirky tidbit? In the 1960s, a psychic named Edgar Cayce insisted Atlantis would rise again near the Bahamas. His predictions sparked entire cottage industries of treasure hunters, scanning the ocean floor for marble columns, crystal pyramids, and possibly misplaced Starbucks locations. You float closer, your fingers brushing coral-crusted capitals of what might be old pillars, or might just be rocks that look suspiciously pillar-like if you squint hard enough. The water's so blue it almost hurts your eyes, and schools of bright fish flit through open doorways as if guarding secrets older than memory. You can't help imagining the city as Plato described it. Rings of land and sea circling a shining palace, bridges spanning canals, bronze walls reflecting sunlight. People bustling through markets, gold and silver glittering under awnings of silk. It's like Las Vegas, if Vegas were a moral lesson about hubris and divine punishment. And here's a funny thing. Atlantis has become sort of a celebrity among lost cities. It's the Kardashian of ancient legends, always in the headlines. Nobody sure why it's famous anymore, yet we can't look away. Historians still argue whether Plato's measurements of Atlantis' size were accurate or wildly exaggerated for dramatic effect. According to his account, the central island alone was nearly 9 kilometers across, surrounded by perfectly engineered canals. Some scholars think he lifted architectural details from real places like ancient Thera or the Minoan civilization on Crete, which did suffer a volcanic cataclysm. Others roll their eyes and mutter, Plato was just vibing, man. Yet there's something seductive about imagining a city swallowed whole by the ocean. Because if Atlantis could vanish, maybe other cities could too, hidden right under our noses. You swirl through the water, peering into archways where pink sea anemones sway like ghostly curtains. And every flicker of fish scales makes you wonder, is that glint off a fish? or a piece of ancient gold jewelry lost centuries ago. And oh, the modern asides you hear from folks hunting for Atlantis. One theory says it's in Spain's marshes. Another insists it's near the Caribbean. And some claim Google Earth images show suspiciously geometric patterns on the ocean floor. Meanwhile, skeptical archaeologists sigh heavily and refill their coffee mugs. Still, there's a reason Atlantis won't leave our cultural brain. It's the perfect cocktail of mystery, treasure, and moral lesson. A thriving empire felled by arrogance, leaving only ruins that glow faintly beneath the waves. Its human pride reduced to barnacle-covered stones. And besides, who wouldn't want to discover Atlantis? Instant fame, maybe a Netflix deal, and you'd probably get your own line of merch. I found Atlantis, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. But as you drift onward, you start realizing that Atlantis isn't just a lost city. It's a symbol. A symbol of how even mighty civilizations can vanish almost overnight, leaving nothing but fish and coral to inherit the streets. So you give one last look to those submerged corridors. Tiny fish dart away as if afraid you'll spill their secrets. Then you rise slowly toward the surface, leaving Atlantis beneath the waves, still waiting, as it has for millennia, for someone to prove it was ever there at all. Your body rises from the ocean's embrace and finds solid ground once more. Only this time, heat shimmers off red stone as far as your eyes can see. You're standing before sheer cliffs, stained in every hue of pink and crimson, as though the gods spilled their watercolor set across the mountains. Welcome to Petra. The path winds through a narrow gorge. The sick. Towering rock walls lean in so close above your head that slivers of sky become ribbons of blue silk, swaying between rust-colored cliffs. It's like walking through a secret corridor built just for you. And your footsteps echo in the hush like you're trespassing somewhere holy. Historians still argue whether the Nabateans carved Petra purely as a trading hub, or as a sacred city devoted to ritual and grandeur. The mainstream fact is clear. The Nabateans built this place between the 4th century BCE and the 2nd century CE, turning desert rock into a metropolis that once dazzled all of Rome. And here's a quirky tidbit. The Nabateans were so good at water engineering that they hid entire reservoirs inside mountains, gathering precious rain in a desert where most people would die of thirst. It's like ancient urban planning meets desert-level stealth mode. You keep moving until the Styx spills you out into a blinding sunlit plaza. And there it is, the treasury. It rises almost 5 stories high, carved entirely from the cliff face. Columns soar upward, framing intricate carvings of eagles, floral scrolls, and figures whose identities remain debated to this day. The sandstone glows a soft pink in the morning, a deep blood red at dusk, and every shade between as the sun dances across its surface. It's mesmerizing. And let's be real, every tourist comes here thinking of Indiana Jones, because apparently nothing says archaeological wonder like Harrison Ford dodging booby traps. Yet even while it's beautiful, Petra feels empty. You step closer, running your fingers along grooves in the rock, tracing letters written in an alphabet long forgotten. And you wonder, how does a city that once held 20,000 people fall so silent? Some say earthquakes cracked the aqueducts, cutting off Petra's lifeline of water. Others point to shifting trade routes that left the city stranded as new roads bypassed its gates. Historians still argue whether the Roman annexation helped Petra survive longer or hastened its decline by draining its wealth. As you wander deeper, Petra's grandeur keeps unfolding. Tomb facades that tower like apartment buildings, staircases carved into solid stone, corridors leading to high places where priests once watched the sunrise over sacred peaks. And then there are the whispers, stories that the treasury's urn at the top once held a pharaoh's gold, and that locals fired bullets at it to crack it open. The pockmarks remain, proof of centuries of treasure hunters armed with bad aim and high hopes. Sometimes you hear tales about Petra as if it's still alive, like how Bedouins once concealed its location from outsiders, wrapping its presence in myth and fierce protection, or how echoes bounce so perfectly in the sick that secret conversations might still linger there if you listen hard enough. You pause under the cool shade of a high wall, feeling the desert breeze whisk dust from your hair. The scent of hot sandstone mixes with faint hints of wild herbs growing between the cracks. And somewhere in the distance, a single bird trills, its call bouncing back and forth off the cliffs like an ancient voice. But no matter how many people visit today, there's an inescapable loneliness to Petra. It's like the walls remember the laughter of merchants, the chanted prayers of priests, and the quiet conversations of lovers meeting by moonlight. And now, they hold all those secrets in silence. You glance back one last time at the treasury, glowing rosy gold in the desert light, and you wonder if Petra's true treasure was never gold hidden in stone urns, but the memory of life itself, echoing faintly through corridors where no one walks anymore. Heat and crimson cliffs fade behind you, replaced by the scent of salt and the hush of gentle waves rolling onto a sandy shore. You stand beneath towering pines that sway in the breeze, their needles sighing like quiet gossip among old friends. This is Roanoke Island, and tonight, you're about to try cracking one of history's creepiest "where'd everybody go" moments. It's the late 16th century. Picture it. Wooden ships creaking into harbor. English settlers stepping onto a strange, humid shore. They're here to stake a claim in the new world, and to try not starving in the process. Historians still argue whether England's first permanent settlement would have succeeded if it hadn't been for famine, storms, and awkward diplomatic relations with local tribes. The mainstream fact is this. The Roanoke colony was founded in 1587 under Governor John White. White sailed back to England for supplies. And when he finally returned 3 years later, the entire colony had vanished. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. The only clue they left behind was a single word carved into a fence post: Croatoan. No screaming diary entries, no skeletons scattered across the sand. Just one cryptic word, like the world's worst post-it note. You step carefully through crunchy sand, imagining the settlers' footprints fading in the tide. You hear the faint creak of ghostly ship rigging, see flashes of pale sails disappearing beyond the dunes. The air feels charged, like the island's secrets are just waiting for you to lean closer and listen. And here's where it gets deliciously weird. Historians still argue whether the colonists were massacred, assimilated into Native American tribes, or simply relocated. Some theories say they headed inland to join the friendly Croatoan people. Others claim they tried to sail back to England on their own, and perished at sea. One theory even suggests a Spanish raid wiped them out to sabotage English expansion. Modern archaeologists keep poking around Roanoke, turning up tiny clues. A piece of pottery here, a rusty sword hilt there. Nothing definitive. It's like history dangling a carrot just out of reach. And then there's the psychic crowd. Over the centuries, more than one medium has claimed to channel the colonists. Their messages generally boil down to something along the lines of, "Yep, things went south real quick." Not terribly helpful. You trudge deeper into the pines, imagining cabins standing here once, smoke curling from chimneys. You picture mothers tending fires, kids chasing each other between tree trunks, and then silence. One moment there was life, the next, emptiness. It's chilling to realize that an entire community can vanish so completely that even their bones don't remain to tell the tale. You bend to touch the soft grass, half expecting it to whisper secrets about what really happened. But it just shivers under your fingers, cool and damp. If you ever want to mess with a friend, just say, "Historians still argue whether Roanoke settlers are your next-door neighbor's great-great-grandparents." Guaranteed goosebumps. But while Roanoke may be America's first unsolved colonial mystery, it's far from the only forgotten city we'll explore tonight. You lift your gaze toward the distant waves. Somewhere past that horizon, more stories wait, wrapped in fog and legend. And as the breeze rustles the pines overhead, you hear a soft voice in the wind, Croatoan. And just like that, the island feels alive again, for one haunting moment. The salty air of Roanoke dissolves, replaced by dry heat shimmering across an endless African plain. The sun blazes overhead, casting sharp shadows on tawny grass. You step forward, boots crunching on dusty earth, and there it is, an enormous stone wall curving like the spine of some ancient beast across the hilltop. Welcome to Great Zimbabwe. Here, the air tastes faintly of granite dust and old secrets. Massive stones are stacked higher than a two-story house, each block fitted so perfectly that not a drop of mortar holds them together. It's like the ancient builders played Jenga, but on nightmare mode. Historians still argue whether the walls were strictly royal enclosures or also served ritual purposes tied to the community's social hierarchy. The mainstream fact is this: Great Zimbabwe was the center of a powerful kingdom that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries. It controlled trade routes rich in gold, ivory, and exotic goods flowing all the way to the Swahili coast. And the quirky tidbit? In the 19th century, European explorers couldn't believe local Africans had built such monumental architecture. So they invented wild theories about lost white tribes, aliens, or random Phoenicians. Because obviously, the logical explanation for giant stone walls is always aliens. You run your fingers across the stones, feeling the warmth stored from the sun. Some of the walls zigzag into narrow passages, while others curve into wide enclosures big enough to hold thousands of people. Each stone whispers tales of trade, power, and mystery. The biggest structure here is the Great Enclosure, a massive elliptical wall stretching over 250 meters around, with towers rising like granite sentinels. As you wander its shadowed corridors, you imagine royal processions, drums pounding, dancers swirling in bright cloth. The sound of commerce fills the air. Traders counting beads, weighing gold dust, haggling over ivory tusks. But even as life thrived here, the city's ultimate purpose remains hazy. Historians still argue whether the towering walls were purely defensive, religious symbols, or bold statements of royal prestige. Some scholars believe the conical towers inside the great enclosure were grain stores symbolizing wealth. Others think they were ritual structures. Nobody agrees, but everyone's fascinated. You pause under an acacia tree, squinting across the plains. Imagine caravans shimmering in the heat haze, lines of donkeys and men carrying trade goods destined for ports along the Indian Ocean. The kingdom's reach stretched far beyond these walls, tied to international networks that connected Africa to Persia, India, and China. And talk about hidden treasures. In 1906, British archaeologist David Randall McIver unearthed thousands of gold artifacts here, along with soapstone birds perched on columns. These birds, beautifully carved and mysterious, are today Zimbabwe's national emblem, a reminder that history's forgotten walls still shape modern identity. A soft breeze whistles through the narrow corridors, carrying the faint scent of grass and distant wood smoke. You can almost hear voices chanting praises to a long-vanished king whose name we'll never know. And if you're ever looking to spice up a dinner party, casually drop this line. Historians still argue whether Great Zimbabwe's decline was due to climate change, overgrazing, or shifting trade routes. Instant conversation starter or killer. As the sun begins to set, the granite stones blaze gold and orange, casting dramatic shadows like jagged teeth. You wonder how many secrets lie buried under the earth here, waiting for a future archaeologist or a curious traveler like you to uncover them. And you can't help feeling awe. Great Zimbabwe's walls are more than ancient stone. They're proof that, even in forgotten places, brilliance once flourished, leaving behind whispers that echo through the centuries. The sun-scorched plains of Africa fade away, and in their place rises a living wall of green. Steam curls upward from mossy earth, and the air is so thick and wet it clings to your skin like silk. Cicadas drone a hypnotic rhythm somewhere high in the canopy. You're in the jungles of Chiapas, Mexico, and the trees here are giants, their trunks twisted with vines as thick as your wrist. The jungle breathes around you, alive with rustles and bird calls, as if the forest itself wants to keep secrets hidden forever. Welcome to Palenque. You push aside a curtain of leaves, and there it is. A stone staircase rising out of the undergrowth, half swallowed by centuries of green. At the top, a temple crowned with sculpted roof combs juts above the treetops, peering out like a lost sentinel. Historians still argue whether Palenque's rise was fueled purely by royal ambition, or if its kings were driven by cosmic prophecies and intricate Mayan calendars. The mainstream fact is this: Palenque flourished mostly between the 5th and 8th centuries CE, a jewel of the classic Maya civilization, renowned for its exquisite architecture and hieroglyphic inscriptions. And here's a quirky tidbit. The Mayan king Tikal the Great ruled for nearly 70 years, becoming king at age 12. Imagine handing your entire kingdom over to a preteen. Your national budget would include a suspicious number of ball courts and candy offerings to the gods. You climb the steps carefully, palms brushing the cool stone slick with moss. Birds shriek overhead, brilliant flashes of turquoise and red. Somewhere, a howler monkey bellows a guttural roar that sounds like an angry dragon. The Temple of the Inscriptions, towers above you. Its staircase is narrow and steep. It's here, beneath tons of limestone, that King Pakal's tomb lay hidden for centuries. A crypt so elaborately carved, it sparked wild theories that Pakal was an ancient astronaut launching his spaceship. Historians still argue whether that famous sarcophagus lid truly depicts Pakal descending into the underworld, or piloting a cosmic rocket. But one thing is certain: Palenque's artistry is stunning. Walls drip with hieroglyphs describing royal lineages, astronomical events, and wars. Bas-reliefs show elegantly dressed nobles performing rituals, wearing elaborate headdresses taller than most toddlers. You step into one of the palace corridors, where sunlight slants through lattice windows. The air smells of damp stone and something older. Incense? Sweat? Ghosts? Your footsteps echo, and for a moment you swear you hear chanting voices reciting prayers to gods whose names have vanished from human tongues. The deeper you wander, the clearer it becomes that this city was built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. Palenque's builders oriented temples with mathematical precision to track solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. It's like ancient architecture meets a cosmic spreadsheet. Yet for all its splendor, Palenque fell into decline and silence. Historians still argue whether drought, warfare, political turmoil, or trade disruptions triggered its downfall. By the time the jungle reclaimed it, the great plazas lay empty. Vines creeping over carved faces, animals nesting where kings once ruled. You trail your fingertips across a glyph that might record a royal wedding, or a prophecy of doom. The stone is slick, cool, and stubbornly silent. And if you ever want to confuse your friends, casually mention that some scholars believe Pakal's crypt was the inspiration for modern sci-fi alien theories. Bonus points if you imitate a howler monkey mid-sentence. But Palenque is more than alien conspiracies or crumbling temples. It's a reminder that human ingenuity can create breathtaking wonders, even in a jungle determined to devour them back into green oblivion. You pause at the top of a temple, staring out over endless jungle. Birds wheel in lazy spirals, and shafts of sunlight break through the canopy like golden spears. Somewhere below, stone corridors wind deeper into secrets we've yet to uncover. And as the breeze stirs leaves around your feet, you can almost hear the faint rhythm of drums and voices chanting prayers that once carried through this city of kings. You blink, and the humid breath of the jungle vanishes, replaced by a fierce chill that seeps through your clothes and numbs your fingertips. Snowflakes drift lazily from a pale sky, settling on ancient stones like lace. Under your boots, the snow crunches, a sound sharp and lonely against the hush of an empty plain. Welcome to Ani, the city of 1001 churches. You stand on a high plateau in eastern Turkey, staring at a skyline of crumbling cathedrals and fortress walls. Once, Ani was a capital brimming with life, its streets packed with merchants, priests, and traders from far-flung lands. Now, wind howls through hollow windows, rattling the carved arches as though trying to whisper the city's secrets. Historians still argue whether Ani's downfall was driven primarily by brutal invasions, economic decline, or the shifting course of the Silk Road. The mainstream fact is this: Ani reached its peak during the 10th and 11th centuries as the capital of the Bagratid Armenian kingdom, boasting a population of over 100,000 and rivaling Constantinople in splendor. And here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval travelers described Ani as so grand that You could not find another city like it for riches or beauty. Which basically means Ani was the medieval equivalent of a 5-star Instagram hotspot. You step closer to the Cathedral of Ani, its elegant pointed arches rising stark against the snow. Inside, stone pillars stand like sentinels beneath a collapsed dome, shafts of cold light slanting in through holes in the roof. The silence feels so absolute that even your breath seems intrusive. You imagine choirs once filling this space with hymns, priests swinging censers, and crowds gathering under flickering candlelight. Now, frost sparkles on the altar, and pigeons coo from the rafters where saints' faces once gazed down in painted frescoes. It's strange to think how quickly fortunes can change. Historians still argue whether the city's capture by the Byzantines, Seljuks, or Mongols did the most damage. Each new conqueror added scars to Ani's walls, and by the 14th century, the city was bleeding people, wealth, and hope. You wander through narrow streets where broken arches frame glimpses of snow-covered plains stretching into the distance. It's bitterly cold, yet beautiful. A stark, haunting beauty that makes you feel both insignificant and profoundly connected to history. In some corners, you find delicate carvings half buried in ice. Crosses, floral patterns, inscriptions in Armenian script. They look like ancient lace frozen in time. And if you ever want to add drama to a conversation, say, historians still argue whether Ani's final ruin came from earthquakes, war, or politics, or all three. People will either be fascinated or politely edge away. You climb a section of the old fortress wall. The wind nearly knocks you off your feet, but the view is worth it. You see stone churches dotting the plain, each one a lonely relic of faith and power. Far below, the Akurian River cuts a deep gorge, a natural moat that once helped protect the city. On the other side lies Armenia, so close you feel you could almost whisper across the border. One legend says Ani is cursed to remain empty because too much blood was spilled within its walls. Another claims the city's stones still weep for their lost people, crying silent tears of snow. You descend from the wall, boots slipping on icy stones. A few ravens burst into flight, black wings stark against the white landscape. Their calls echo off the cathedral walls, adding to the eerie symphony of the city's frozen silence. And as you leave Ani's gates, the snow drifts back over your footprints, erasing the evidence that you were ever here. The city returns to its slumber, waiting for the next traveler or dreamer to wake it again. Snow and stone dissolve around you, giving way to bright Greek sunlight and the sharp scent of salt riding the breeze. You stand in a broad coastal plain, the sky so blue it nearly hums, while seagulls wheel overhead crying secrets you can't quite understand. Beneath your feet, the ground feels oddly restless. Welcome to Helike. You're standing where a great city once thrived, its streets alive with merchants, priests, and fishermen pulling glittering nets from the Gulf of Corinth. Now there's nothing but flat fields and faint traces of ruins, because one terrible night, the earth decided to swallow Helike whole. Historians still argue whether Helike's destruction was punishment from the gods, pure geological bad luck, or a tragic mix of both. The mainstream fact is this. Around 373 BCE, an enormous earthquake struck the region, followed by a tsunami that obliterated Helike and submerged it beneath the sea. And here's a quirky tidbit. Ancient writers claimed survivors saw bronze statues of Poseidon shimmering beneath the waves for centuries afterward, as if the sea had claimed them for its own trophy room. You take a cautious step forward, half expecting the earth to open under your boots. The ground here is riddled with subtle dips and ridges where archaeologists have dug trenches, seeking walls, pottery, and coins. You kneel, brush away dirt, and imagine the city rising around you once more. Temples gleaming white, crowds pressing forward with baskets of olives and figs, laughter echoing off stone colonnades. And then the ground begins to tremble. Not literally. Don't worry. You're safe. Probably. But you can almost feel the terror of that night. Historical texts describe a roaring sound, like 1,000 chariots rolling across the sky. Cracks tore through the streets, buildings collapsed like houses of cards, and walls split apart to reveal black water bubbling up from the depths. Historians still argue whether Helike sank instantly into a newly formed lagoon, or gradually slipped beneath the sea over hours or days. Some theories suggest the earthquake shifted underground springs, liquefying the soil so the entire city simply disappeared. You step closer to a trench, where archaeologists uncovered streets lined with pottery fragments and scattered bronze coins. It's humbling to realize how fast civilization can vanish. One moment people are baking bread, gossiping about politics, and the next, gone under waves. Helike's fate left a mark on Greek culture. Some scholars believe it inspired Plato's account of Atlantis, a sunken city swallowed by divine wrath. It's the same recipe: a thriving city, catastrophic destruction, and mysterious ruins lurking under the sea. And speaking of odd connections, the region remained a dangerous place for centuries. Later earthquakes kept reminding locals that Helike's story wasn't a one-off event. Historians still argue whether ancient Greek disaster legends were cautionary tales born from Helike's trauma. The funny thing? People kept searching for Helike like it was ancient Greece's lost lottery ticket. For nearly 2,000 years, nobody could pinpoint where it lay. Finally, in the 1990s, archaeologists located submerged ruins in the coastal plain of Cahokia, Greece. The discovery proved Helike was real, and not just another myth. You wander through the site, feeling the breeze ripple your hair. Somewhere nearby, water glints between reeds, marking spots where the city's walls still sleep beneath shallow pools. Fish dart through flooded corridors that once rang with human footsteps. And if you're in the mood to weird out your friends, casually drop. Historians still argue whether Helike inspired Atlantis, or if Atlantis inspired Helike's legend retroactively. That should either start a lively debate or end the dinner party. But tonight, as the sun sinks toward the horizon, you stand in silence, listening for echoes of a city that vanished in a single breath. The wind sighs across the marshes, rustling reeds that might still conceal marble statues and bronze gods waiting to be found again. The salty Greek breeze fades away, replaced by dry, dusty winds sweeping over wide plains. The sun blazes overhead, casting long shadows across sun-baked brick. Your feet crunch on parched earth as you step forward, finding yourself in the middle of streets so perfectly laid out, they look suspiciously modern. Welcome to Mohenjo-Daro. It's one of those names that sounds like a spell. Say it 3 times fast, and you might accidentally summon a brick wall. Historians still argue whether Mohenjo-Daro was the Indus Valley's political capital or more of a thriving commercial hub. The mainstream fact is this. The city flourished around 2500 BCE, boasting one of the world's earliest urban planning marvels, complete with grids, drainage systems, and public baths. And here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists discovered a 7-foot-high statue of a man with a finely trimmed beard and a calm, smug look on his face. It's called the Priest King, and I'm convinced he's silently judging us for our chaotic modern cities. You walk down a broad street lined with crumbling brick walls. Everything is laid out in clean right angles. The avenues are wide enough to fit bullock carts, and there's a sense of order here that feels startlingly advanced. Tiny side alleys branch off into residential blocks. You pass by small chambers with raised platforms, possibly shop counters where merchants once sold beads, cotton cloth, or perhaps the ancient equivalent of mango smoothies. And looming nearby stands the Great Bath, a massive tank sunken into the earth, lined with baked bricks, possibly used for ritual purification or just a really fancy spa day. It's surprisingly well built, complete with drains and waterproofing. Because nothing says civilized society like an obsession with public baths. Historians still argue whether the city fell due to flooding, shifting river courses, or political collapse. Some even theorize climate change dried up the Indus River's tributaries, leaving fields barren and traders scrambling for new routes. Yet what's truly baffling is how suddenly the city seems to have emptied out. No grand signs of conquest, no giant battlefields littered with weapons, just silence. It's like the entire population decided to leave one day, locking the doors behind them. You pause to examine an ancient well, its brick lining still perfectly circular after thousands of years. The air smells faintly of dust and something mineral and cool rising from the depths. In one crumbled room, you notice bits of pottery scattered across the floor. Geometric designs spiral across the shards, hinting at a civilization that adored symmetry and aesthetics. It's mesmerizing. And here's a fun modern aside. Mohenjo-Daro's city grid inspired urban planners worldwide, especially during the British Raj when they realized their own streets were more chaotic than a group chat during a crisis. Some fringe researchers have pushed wild theories, like Mohenjo-Daro was destroyed by an ancient nuclear blast. Apparently, high radiation levels were detected in the soil. But most archaeologists roll their eyes so hard they nearly sprain their corneas. Historians still argue whether the abrupt abandonment was peaceful migration or driven by ecological disaster. No final answer has surfaced, leaving Mohenjo-Daro wrapped in silence. You stand still for a moment, feeling the weight of thousands of years pressing in around you. The wind whistles through the ruins like a voice trying to speak. You almost expect the Priest King statue to lean forward and finally explain it all. But he just keeps staring off into the distance with that infuriating Mona Lisa smirk. As the sun begins to sink, the brick walls glow orange, casting long shadows that stretch like fingers across the empty streets. And you wonder what whispered conversations, market sounds, and laughter once filled these avenues. Somewhere deep in the dust, Mohenjo-Daro keeps its secrets, and maybe that's part of its magic. That a city so advanced, so orderly, could vanish into history's silence, leaving behind perfect bricks and perfect mysteries. The scorching sun over Mohenjo-Daro fades into a gray, windswept sky, The scent of salt hits your nose, sharp and cold. You find yourself standing on a rocky coastline, the Atlantic rolling in with foamy white caps, crashing against jagged cliffs. This is Vinland, or at least it might be. Historians still argue whether Vinland was a single settlement, a region explored briefly, or just a poetic description of lush coastal lands seen by restless Norse sailors. The mainstream fact is this. Around the year 1000 CE, Leif Erikson and fellow Vikings sailed west from Greenland, reaching what they called Vinland, making them the first known Europeans to set foot in North America. And here's a quirky tidbit. Vinland translates to wine land, because the Norse reportedly found grapes growing wild. Either they stumbled upon a natural vineyard, or, let's be honest, they were just super optimistic about turning berries into booze. You stand on a rocky beach, icy wind biting your cheeks. Above you, gulls wheel and scream, sounding suspiciously like Norse warriors screaming insults in Old Norse. You trudge inland, where the land rolls into gentle hills dotted with stunted pine trees and scrub. The soil is sandy, mixed with patches of moss and cranberry bushes. In your mind's eye, you see longships drawn up on the shore, their dragon-headed prows glistening with seawater. You hear the creak of timber and the snap of wool sails. Vikings tramp ashore in cloaks and leather boots, hauling axes, iron tools, and barrels they probably hope to fill with local delicacies, or at least a decent vintage. Historians still argue whether Lansau Meadows in Newfoundland is truly Vinland or just one outpost among many. The site uncovered in the 1960s contains unmistakable Norse structures, iron nails, and even a spindle whorl, hinting at Viking women working there. It's definitive proof the Vikings crossed the Atlantic nearly 500 years before Columbus. Yet the mystery lingers. Why didn't the Norse stay? Was it harsh winters, sparse resources, tense run-ins with indigenous peoples they called the Scrawlings? You brush snow from a low turf wall, running your fingers along ancient timber. In the silence, you can almost hear voices speaking a language full of hard consonants and rolled R's. Maybe they're arguing about sailing home or about who keeps hogging the drinking horn. And here's something modern and strange. In 2016, archaeologists found what might be another Norse site in Newfoundland, marked by traces of bog iron smelting. Historians still argue whether it's evidence of a larger Viking presence, or just wishful thinking fueled by our love of Viking legends. You wander into a low hall built of sod and wood, the roof beams still dark with centuries of smoke. Inside, you smell damp earth, old pine, and something that might be dried fish. Light filters in through a tiny doorway, illuminating depressions in the floor where benches once stood. It's not hard to imagine a winter night here. Vikings huddled around a crackling fire, storytelling in voices low and musical. Each word echoing off the timber walls. Perhaps someone was carving runes into bone, or braiding cord while listening to tales of Thor's hammer-smashing giants. But eventually, the Norse abandoned these shores, slipping away as quietly as they arrived. Historians still argue whether small skirmishes with local tribes convinced them to leave, or if economics simply didn't justify the long voyage. And if you ever want to start an argument, casually suggest that Vikings discovered America. You'll either get enthusiastic agreement or a 30-minute lecture on indigenous history. Outside, the wind tears across the rocky shore. Waves crash in endless rhythm. hiding any secrets buried under kelp and cold seawater. Vinland remains one of history's most tantalizing almosts. A glimpse of what might have been a permanent Viking colony in the New World. Instead, the Norse returned home, leaving only faint traces behind. You look out across the gray Atlantic. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Greenland waits. Beyond that, Iceland. And beyond that, the rugged shores of Norway, where these explorers were born. And as the tide rolls in, carrying the smell of salt and distant lands, you can't help wondering, what other pieces of forgotten history lie just out of sight, waiting for someone brave or curious enough to cross the sea once more? The cold Atlantic winds fade away, replaced by the muggy warmth of a river valley. Cicadas sing high in the cottonwoods, and the air smells of green things, growing, sweet mud, and distant rain. You stand gazing across a vast plain where the horizon ripples with tree lines and rolling hills. Welcome to Cahokia. You squint against the sun as you climb a giant mound of earth rising 100 feet into the sky. Grass ripples across its slopes like velvet, hiding the sweat and toil of thousands who built it basket by basket, handful by handful. This is Monk's Mound, the colossal heart of an ancient city that once ruled these lands. Historians still argue whether Cahokia functioned as a political capital, a religious pilgrimage site, or both. The mainstream fact is this: between 1050 and 1350 CE, Cahokia was North America's largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, home to tens of thousands of people, bigger than London at the same time. And here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists discovered an ancient woodhenge near Cahokia, a ring of massive wooden posts used to mark solstices and equinoxes. Imagine Stonehenge, but with more mosquitoes and fewer druids. You crest the top of Monk's Mound, breathless, gazing over the Mississippi River snaking off toward the horizon. Below, grassy mounds rise from the plain in geometric patterns, arranged like a city meticulously planned by celestial architects. Wide plazas stretch out between them, the ground once pounded flat by countless dancing feet. You close your eyes and imagine the scene. Priests in elaborate feathered cloaks, standing on platforms, signaling to the crowds below. Drums boom, fires flicker. Traders arrive carrying shells from the Gulf, obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes. Cahokia thrummed with life, culture, and power. It was a place where astronomical knowledge shaped daily life, where giant mounds aligned perfectly with solar events, as if the city itself was an enormous calendar ticking off the days. Yet even amid splendor, darkness lurked. Archaeologists have unearthed mass graves, suggesting human sacrifice as part of religious rituals. Historians still argue whether these sacrifices were occasional or systematic, part of royal power or emergency appeasement of gods. It's one of those debates that ensures you'll either fascinate your dinner guests or get uninvited next time. As you descend the mound, you pass patches of earth where fragments of pottery and tools still surface after rainstorms. You imagine the people who crafted them, farmers, artisans, hunters, all contributing to a city that may have housed over 20,000 souls at its peak. Then, as swiftly as it rose, Cahokia faded. Historians still argue whether climate change, resource depletion, political upheaval, or diseases brought by distant trade networks caused its decline. No single answer fits perfectly. The city simply emptied out. You wander through a wide plaza, wind rustling tall grass around you. It's eerily silent except for the rustle of prairie plants and the call of a red-winged blackbird. And here's something modern and funny. Monk's Mound is so massive that early European settlers thought it was a natural hill. They even planned to build a hotel on top in the 19th century, presumably for the world's most scenic view of the Mississippi floodplain, and possibly for the world's most inconvenient room service. Yet despite centuries of neglect and partial destruction, Cahokia endures. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, still hiding secrets in its earthen walls. You pause, running your fingers through tall grass that hides centuries of human labor. The breeze carries whispers of forgotten rituals and echoes of a people who once turned rivers, forests, and fields into a civilization that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. And as you look across the flat Illinois plain, it's hard not to wonder how many other lost cities might lie beneath the soil, waiting for someone like you to discover them again. The prairie winds of Cahokia melt away into thick, humid air that clings to your skin like warm honey. The sun filters through towering ceiba trees, dappling the mossy ground with shifting green light. A chorus of insects buzzes all around you, punctuated by sudden shrieks from birds hidden in the canopy. Welcome to Tikal. You stand ankle-deep in leaf litter, staring at massive stone steps rising before you. They climb skyward into a towering pyramid whose peak pierces through the jungle canopy like the blade of a stone knife. It's breathtaking and, honestly, a little intimidating. Historians still argue whether Tikal was the undisputed capital of a powerful Maya superstate or part of a shifting alliance network among rival city-states. The mainstream fact is this: Tikal flourished between 200 and 900 CE as one of the greatest cities of the Maya civilization, home to tens of thousands, its pyramids rising above the forest like silent sentinels. And here's a quirky tidbit. Tikal's rulers named themselves with titles like Great Sun Lord, which sounds simultaneously awe-inspiring and like the leader of a very committed beach volleyball team. You climb the steps, your breath coming faster in the thick air. Roots writhe across the stone like petrified snakes. Birds with plumage brighter than any gemstone flit past your shoulder, screaming warnings that sound suspiciously like, "Turn back." But you keep going, emerging atop Temple 4, the tallest pyramid here. From this height, the jungle stretches endlessly in every direction. Green waves roll away from you, hiding secrets in their depths. Imagine the soundscape here when Tikal was at its height. Drums pounding in temple plazas, priests chanting in low melodic syllables, messengers sprinting across causeways bearing messages written on folded bark paper. The air would have smelled of burning copal resin, sweat, and crushed flowers. Yet there's an eerie silence here now. The plazas below lie empty, paved stones peeking through carpets of moss. Tall stelae stand engraved with hieroglyphs that record victories, alliances, and cosmic rituals, but many of their inscriptions remain only partially deciphered. Like a history half-written in a forgotten tongue. Historians still argue whether Tikal fell due to prolonged drought, internecine warfare, trade disruptions, or social upheaval from a disillusioned populace. The so-called classic Maya collapse remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing mysteries. You descend into the Grand Plaza, where Temple 1, the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rises over the ball court. You picture royal processions sweeping past, nobles in feathered headdresses trailing scents of crushed blossoms. Somewhere, a priest raises a conch shell to his lips and blows a blast so loud it rattles your ribs. Tikal was a city of astronomical precision. Its builders aligned pyramids and causeways to track the movements of Venus, eclipses, and solstices. It's like they built stone calculators to predict the future, and occasionally to schedule the next giant party. And speaking of parties, archaeologists discovered residue of cacao mixed with chili pepper inside Tikal's pottery vessels. Historians still argue whether the Maya invented the world's first spicy hot chocolate, which, frankly, sounds like either genius or culinary chaos. You wander into a palace complex where dark, narrow hallways twist like a labyrinth. The air grows cooler here, damp with the smell of ancient plaster and mildew. A few bats flutter overhead, tiny wings slicing the silence. You pause beside a carved panel depicting a king wearing a towering headdress studded with jade. His eyes stare blankly over your shoulder, as if remembering secrets no one alive knows anymore. If you ever want to break the ice at a party, just say. Historians still argue whether Tikal's political alliances were based on trade, religious ties, or strategic marriages. Then enjoy the stunned silence or the nerdy debates that inevitably follow. Stepping out into the light again, you feel the jungle pressing close. The city seems almost alive, breathing around you, vines creeping over ancient stones. And as you leave the Grand Plaza, you look back at Tikal's pyramids jutting skyward, half swallowed by green. They stand as proof that even in the densest jungle, humanity once built cities that reached for the stars. The humid jungle mists of Tikal dissolve into warm, dry air, carrying the faint fragrance of lotus flowers and ancient stone. Sunlight pours down like liquid gold, revealing soft green hills scattered with round domes rising gently from the earth. The air feels hushed, as though even the birds are whispering out of respect. Welcome to Sanchi. You stand at the foot of the great stupa, its smooth hemispherical dome gleaming pale beneath a flawless blue sky. Carved gateways, Toranas, stand around it like silent guardians, each panel crowded with delicate carvings of lions, elephants, swirling vines, and serene figures meditating beneath trees. Historians still argue whether Sanchi was primarily a pilgrimage hub for distant travelers or a local monastic community's center of spiritual life. The mainstream fact is this: Sanchi flourished as a major Buddhist site from the 3rd century BCE onward, founded under Emperor Ashoka, whose reign spread Buddhism across the Indian subcontinent. And here's a quirky tidbit. The gateways at Sanchi were originally brightly painted in vivid reds, blues, and greens. So imagine your peaceful spiritual retreat looking suspiciously like a Buddhist version of a carnival. You begin to walk slowly around the stupa, moving clockwise, the traditional direction of reverence. Your footsteps crunch lightly on the gravel path, and warm breezes swirl the scent of dust, sun-warmed stone, and faint whiffs of incense left behind by modern pilgrims. Above you, the carvings seem alive. You see scenes of the Buddha's past lives, ships sailing rough seas, merchants with elaborate turbans, and dancing celestial beings with smiles as calm as moonlight. Yet despite the peace radiating from this place, you can't help feeling echoes of centuries of footsteps that once passed this way. Monks in saffron robes, travelers from distant lands seeking merit, lay people offering flowers, rice, and prayers for the next life. Historians still argue whether certain panels on the gateways depict purely religious scenes or coded political propaganda to legitimize Ashoka's rule. Some scholars believe specific carvings even record real historical events disguised as Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's earlier lives. And here's something unexpectedly relatable. Sanchi's stupa was forgotten for centuries, overgrown and buried beneath earth and scrub. It wasn't until British explorers stumbled across it in the early 19th century that it was restored to public knowledge. Imagine discovering a World Heritage Site while just out for a hike. You pause before one of the Taranas and trace your fingers over the cool stone. A lion snarls in mid-leap. Below it, tiny figures carry baskets of offerings. Each groove and swirl tells a story older than most countries still standing today. And the monks, you can almost see them still. Walking single file at dawn, bowls in hand, chanting softly, their bare feet brushing stone, their prayers rising with the sunrise. Sanchi's architecture isn't just beautiful, it's brilliantly mathematical. The great stupa's dome and surrounding railings were designed using geometric principles meant to symbolize the Buddhist cosmos. Historians still argue whether these proportions were devised by royal architects or monks trained in sacred geometry. The breeze ruffles your hair, carrying the distant call of a koel bird. Lotus ponds shimmer under the sun, leaves drifting like small green boats across the surface. If you ever want to drop a fun fact at a party, try this. Historians still argue whether Sanchi's art is purely religious storytelling or secret political messaging. And watch your friends blink in bewilderment. Walking onward, you pass smaller stupas and monastery ruins half sunk into grassy hills. Grasshoppers spring away from your feet. Sunlight glints off polished stone that still bears tool marks from artisans who lived over 2,000 years ago. And as you leave Sanchi's gates, the scent of lotus and warm sandstone lingers around you. It feels as though the footsteps of monks echo in your own steps, a soft reminder that even forgotten pilgrim paths still ripple through history's quiet places. The soft lotus breezes of Sanchi fade into dry, sun-baked air, tinged with the dusty aroma of ancient parchment and baked clay. You find yourself standing at the crossroads of civilizations, where East met West long before anyone thought to call them that. Welcome to Taxila. All around you lie low stone walls marking classrooms, courtyards, and monastic cells. The ground crunches underfoot, littered with pottery shards and fragments of stone inscriptions. A soft wind rustles through scraggly grass, and for a moment, you can almost hear the low murmur of voices reciting lessons in Sanskrit and Greek. Historians still argue whether Taxila was primarily a religious university, a cosmopolitan trade hub, or both. The mainstream fact is this. From around the 5th century BCE to the 5th century CE, Taxila was one of the world's great learning centers, attracting students from as far as Persia, Central Asia, and Greece. And here's a quirky tidbit. The famous Indian physician Charaka, known as the father of Ayurveda, is said to have taught here. So, you might say, Taxila was offering health advice long before the invention of influencer wellness podcasts. You step into a roofless chamber where the sun falls in golden squares across cracked paving stones. The space once rang with voices debating philosophy, politics, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and probably who made the best mango lassi in town. Scholars in flowing robes would gather under carved pillars, scribes bending over palm leaf manuscripts, quills scratching out knowledge destined for distant kingdoms. Taxila was where emperors, generals, and philosophers crossed paths. Chandragupta Maurya, founder of India's Mauryan Empire, is rumored to have studied here under the brilliant strategist Chanakya. Historians still argue whether that mentorship really happened or grew into legend over centuries. A faint breeze stirs, carrying the scent of hot stone and dry herbs. You run your fingers over an inscription in Kharosthi script, its grooves still sharp despite the centuries. Somewhere nearby, you imagine students arguing over metaphysical riddles or memorizing lists of medicinal herbs. Taxila wasn't just one campus. It was an urban sprawl of learning, trade, and culture. Markets bustled with traders hawking silks, spices, gemstones, and scrolls in multiple languages. The roar of barter mixed with the quieter hum of scholarly debate. It was, in short, the ultimate study abroad destination. Historians still argue whether Taxila's universities operated under centralized administration or as independent schools run by individual teachers. Some believe students paid fees directly to their gurus, while others think state sponsorship kept the lights on. And here's a modern aside. Archaeologists found Greco-Roman coins here, alongside Buddhist stupas and Hindu temples. Taxila was an intellectual melting pot long before the phrase global village was trendy. You wander deeper among the ruins, where stone pathways twist between collapsed pillars and shaded courtyards. You can almost see students scribbling notes, sweat glistening on their foreheads as they tried to memorize entire treatises on logic. If you ever want to baffle your friends, casually announce. Historians still argue whether Taxila's teaching methods influenced early Greek academies, or vice versa. You'll either spark fascinated discussion or get politely offered a snack to change the topic. But eventually, even great centers of learning fall silent. By the 5th century CE, waves of invasions and political upheaval swept through the region. The classrooms emptied, scrolls were lost or scattered, and Taxila faded into dust. You pause beneath a stupa's shadow, looking out across plains shimmering in the afternoon heat. Somewhere in the distance, caravans once carried Taxila's knowledge outward along the Silk Road, spreading ideas that still echo today. And as you walk away from the ruins, you can't help feeling a quiet hope that somewhere, a fragment of a palm leaf manuscript still waits to be found, holding secrets from this vanished world of scholars. The dusty lecture halls of Taxila fade into hot, glaring sunlight, reflecting off endless waves of golden sand. Wind scours your face as you stand beneath a pale blue sky so bright it's almost painful to look at. In the distance, the Mediterranean sparkles like a strip of molten silver. Welcome to Leptis Magna. Here, the desert and the sea collide in a forgotten masterpiece of Roman ambition. You brush sand from your eyes and gaze out over fallen columns, triumphal arches, and paved streets vanishing under dunes. It's like discovering Rome's grand avenues transplanted into the middle of the Sahara, only half buried in silence. Historians still argue whether Leptis Magna's decline was driven mostly by the shifting course of the Wadi Lebda River, barbarian invasions, or the crumbling finances of a sprawling Roman empire stretched too thin. The mainstream fact is this: Leptis Magna rose to prominence under Emperor Septimius Severus, who was born here in 145 CE and poured imperial wealth into transforming his hometown into one of the grandest cities of Roman Africa. And here's a quirky tidbit. Septimius Severus reportedly imported an entire team of architects and artisans from Rome to ensure his North African hometown would look appropriately Roman. Nothing like hometown pride with an imperial budget. You step forward onto a once busy street paved in massive limestone slabs. Sand has drifted across the stones, sculpting ripples like ocean waves frozen mid-tide. You run your fingers over fluted columns, their delicate carvings eroded, yet still elegant. Beyond an archway rises the grand Severan Basilica. Inside, towering marble columns stand like a forest of petrified trees. Sunlight slants through broken windows, illuminating floor mosaics that once gleamed beneath the footsteps of senators and merchants. Imagine the city at its height. Ships arriving from Egypt and Spain, cargo holds stuffed with olive oil, grain, and exotic animals destined for Rome's arenas. Merchants haggle in Latin, Greek, Punic, and Berber. Wealth flows in like tidewater, and every public building drips with imperial excess. But even amid such splendor, shadows gathered. Historians still argue whether rising desert sands slowly choked the harbor, making trade impossible, or if Vandal invasions delivered the final blow. It's a perfect reminder that nature and politics both have a nasty habit of ending good real estate deals. You wander into the marketplace. The stone counters are still visible where fish once lay on beds of cool, wet rushes. You picture vendors calling out prices, the warm smell of bread mixing with tangy olives and salt air. Then you step into the amphitheater. Sand covers the lower seats, but you can almost hear the roar of crowds cheering chariots, gladiators, or maybe a particularly spicy poetry recital. Because hey, Romans were into all sorts of entertainment. And here's something modern and strange. Leptis Magna is one of the best preserved Roman cities in the world because shifting sands covered it for centuries, accidentally protecting it from stone thieves and the ravages of time. Historians still argue whether ongoing instability in modern Libya will allow proper preservation or leave the city vulnerable yet again. If you want to sound cool at a party, say, historians still argue whether Leptis Magna's harbor was Rome's greatest North African engineering feat or its most spectacular failure. Instant historian street cred, or, at the very least, some curious looks. As you walk beneath the graceful arches of the Severan Forum, the breeze carries the faint smell of salt and hot stone. You pause, imagining senators in togas, scribes scuttling past with wax tablets, and traders from distant kingdoms arriving with camels loaded with ivory and incense. The silence now feels absolute, broken only by the sigh of wind slipping through marble columns. And as the dunes slowly reclaim the city stone by stone, you realize that Leptis Magna is both a monument to human brilliance and a cautionary tale about how even empires fade beneath shifting sands. You leave the ruins behind, footprints quickly filled by drifting grains, as though the desert itself prefers to keep this Roman gem hidden just a little longer. The hot African winds and shifting dunes of Leptis Magna fade into cool twilight, and the air grows dense with dust and the scent of old stone. You find yourself standing before colossal gates, flanked by stone lions whose eyes once glared over the mightiest city in the ancient world. Welcome to Nineveh. You step carefully across cracked earth littered with fragments of bricks, cuneiform tablets, and the memories of vanished empires. The sun sinks low on the horizon, staining the sky blood red as if it remembers the violence and glory once written into these stones. Historians still argue whether Nineveh's sudden fall was driven more by internal rebellions, brutal enemies, or ecological disasters that dried up once fertile lands. The mainstream fact is this: Nineveh was the Assyrian Empire's last great capital, reaching its peak in the 7th century BCE under kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, before collapsing in a catastrophic siege around 612 BCE. And here's a quirky tidbit. King Ashurbanipal assembled one of the world's first known libraries here. Tens of thousands of clay tablets filled with myths, laws, and scholarly texts. So technically, Nineveh's royal palace was a mashup of Game of Thrones and a giant public library. You walk beneath the once mighty walls, now tumbled down and half swallowed by earth. The air buzzes with insects and distant calls of birds roosting among broken towers. It's quiet, eerily so. Imagine Nineveh at its height. Soldiers in bronze helmets marching through massive gates. Royal messengers galloping out across the empire. Scribes bent over clay tablets recording tribute from distant lands. Sculpted reliefs covered palace walls, depicting kings slaying lions, conquering cities, and receiving tribute. Some of these reliefs remain today, scattered across museum halls from London to Baghdad. Historians still argue whether the lion hunts depicted were genuine sport or staged royal propaganda designed to show off the king's "I'm tougher than a lion" credentials. You step into the shadow of a fallen archway, its bricks covered in inscriptions. Soft wind stirs the dust at your feet, as though invisible scribes are still busy at work. Ashurbanipal, perhaps Nineveh's most famous ruler, was a complex character. Fierce conqueror, yes, but also a scholar obsessed with gathering knowledge. Among the myths preserved in his library was the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest known epic tale, featuring heroes, gods, and a great flood. And speaking of floods, historians still argue whether the Tigris River contributed to Nineveh's downfall by flooding its defenses during the Babylonian and Median siege. Some believe enemy armies diverted rivers to breach the city walls. A literal flood used as a weapon. You run your fingers over a lion relief still standing amid rubble. Its mane is finely carved, its muscles coiled as if ready to spring. You half expect it to blink and step down off the wall. And here's a fun modern aside. In 19th century England, Assyrian wall reliefs shipped from Nineveh inspired the decor of gentlemen's clubs and museums. Because nothing says sophisticated evening like sipping brandy beneath images of bearded kings stabbing lions. Walking through the ruins, you picture flickering torches illuminating long palace corridors. The smell of oil lamps, incense, and crushed flowers lingers in your imagination. If you want to spice up a casual conversation, say, historians still argue whether Nineveh's dramatic fall directly inspired apocalyptic passages in later religious texts, guaranteed to either impress or confuse your friends. As twilight deepens, the lions stare out across a quiet plain where armies once marched. Crickets chirp softly in the growing dark, and the stars begin to prick the sky above the Tigris. You stand there for a long moment, breathing in the hush of this ancient place. Nineveh may be a ruin now, but its stones still echo with the fierce pride of an empire that once dared to rule the known world. The crimson dusk of Nineveh fades, and suddenly the air seems charged with silent watchfulness. You find yourself standing in a broad courtyard, paved in massive stone slabs. Above you, the sun burns pale gold, casting long shadows across carved figures whose wings stretch wide enough to block out the sky. Welcome to Kalhu, also known as Nimrud. Kalhu was another jewel in the crown of Assyria's roaring empire. Here, colossal sculptures rise from the earth like the guardians of some forgotten realm. Beings part man, part lion or bull, and crowned with elaborate helmets. Historians still argue whether Kalhu's massive palaces and statues were designed purely to intimidate foreign envoys, or also to inspire awe among the city's own people. The mainstream fact is this: Kalhu became the Assyrian capital under King Ashur-nasirpal II in the 9th century BCE, transforming into a glittering metropolis of palaces, temples, and gardens. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the city's famous Lamassu statues, those winged creatures with human heads, stand over 10 feet tall and weigh as much as 30 tons. And yet, they somehow manage to look both majestic and faintly annoyed, like bouncers at an exclusive nightclub. You step forward beneath a towering archway, flanked by 2 Lamassu, their bearded faces serene, their wings flared as if ready to lift into the sky. Each feather is carved with almost obsessive detail. It's impossible not to feel small under their gaze. The ground beneath your feet seems to throb with centuries of footsteps. Kings in jeweled robes, scribes hurrying with clay tablets, soldiers in bronze greaves stomping in perfect formation. Kalhu's palace walls were once covered in vivid reliefs. Scenes of lion hunts, feasting, and prisoners brought in chains fill the corridors. Historians still argue whether these images were purely propaganda or documentation of real events. Some scholars believe the bloody imagery served to terrify would-be rebels. Others think the reliefs were simply ancient royal Instagram posts. Look how awesome my empire is. You pause at a wall where a relief shows Ashur-nasirpal II spearing a lion. Blood gushes from the animal's flank, rendered in meticulous detail. Even the muscles ripple realistically, frozen in stone. It's both breathtaking and grim. Nearby, you catch sight of an inscription in cuneiform praising the king as King of the Universe and mighty ruler who subdues evil. You can't help thinking he'd have fit right in on modern social media, hashtagging all his victories. Yet beyond the bluster, Kalhu was a place of astonishing artistry and craftsmanship. Carved ivory panels decorated furniture. Gem-studded jewelry glinted in the palace light. Historians still argue whether these luxury goods were mostly imports or crafted locally by skilled artisans. You stroll through an empty throne room where sunlight spills through gaps in collapsed ceilings. The air smells of old dust and warm stone. You can almost hear the echo of sandals slapping on polished floors as royal guards announce the next visitor granted an audience with the king. Here's a fun modern aside. Many Lamassu sculptures removed from Kalhu now reside in museums like the British Museum and the Louvre, towering over crowds of tourists who stare upward, half awed, half trying to figure out how to pronounce Ashur-nasirpal. If you want to throw a curveball into conversation, casually remark, historians still argue whether Kalhu's rapid growth was sustainable or just an imperial vanity project doomed to collapse. Either way, you'll sound deeply intellectual. As empires rose and fell, Kalhu was eventually abandoned, its great palaces left to crumble beneath desert winds. Sand drifted over mosaic floors. The Lamassu remained, still standing silent guard, staring across empty courtyards as though waiting for their king to return. You pause beneath the watchful eyes of one such guardian. The stone is cool under your fingers, etched with the marks of ancient chisels. For a brief moment, it feels as though the winged creature might blink and whisper secrets from a forgotten empire. And then the wind gusts through the courtyard, carrying the dust of vanished kings into the bright, unending sky. The silent desert guardians of Kalhu dissolve into a swirl of heat and the sharp scent of smoke. You blink, and the cool Mesopotamian air is gone, replaced by the dusty warmth of Egypt. Around you rise narrow streets and sun-bleached walls, alive with the hum of markets, clanging hammers, and drifting voices speaking Arabic, Coptic, Greek, and a dozen other tongues. Welcome to Fustat, the original Cairo. Right now, though, it's not quite the bustling metropolis you might expect. Instead, flames rage along wooden balconies. Sparks leap skyward. The air itself seems to shimmer with heat as pillars of black smoke billow upward, blotting out the sun. Historians still argue whether the decision to burn Fustat was pure military necessity or political panic. The mainstream fact is this. In 1168 CE, faced with the approaching Crusader army, Egypt's own vizier, Shawar, ordered Fustat set ablaze rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The inferno raged for 54 days, reducing an entire city to smoking ruins. And here's a quirky tidbit. Records say the fire was so intense that molten lead poured from rooftops and glass melted like sugar. It was less strategic withdrawal and more accidental doomsday barbecue. You push through narrow alleyways where the walls seem to close in, the heat so intense it feels like you're breathing through cloth. The scent of burning timber mixes with spices, old parchment, and singed linen. You hear cries in every direction. People trying to save belongings, animals bolting through the smoke, the roar of flames devouring centuries of history. Before this catastrophe, Fustat was the beating heart of Egypt's Islamic Golden Age. It was founded in the 7th century CE as the first Arab capital in Egypt, a city of grand mosques, thriving markets, and merchants trading silks and spices as far as India and Byzantium. Historians still argue whether it rivaled Baghdad and Damascus in economic power. You stumble into a courtyard where firelight flickers against mosaic tiles. Merchants' ledgers lie scattered, half charred, their Arabic calligraphy still visible in places. Pottery jars crack in the heat, sending sharp reports echoing off stone walls. You pause beneath the towering arches of the Mosque of Amr ibn al-As, Egypt's first mosque. Once its courtyards rang with prayer and scholarship. Now, ash drifts like gray snow through the air, settling on prayer rugs and marble floors. And here's something modern and odd. Fustat's ruins were rediscovered centuries later beneath modern Cairo's layers of streets and houses. Archaeologists found entire neighborhoods buried under debris, filled with pottery, textiles, and ancient tax records. Proof that the city's pulse beat long after the flames died down. Historians still argue whether Fustat ever fully recovered from its burning, or whether the city shifted permanently to the site of modern Cairo instead. Some say Shawar's fire was the final chapter in Fustat's history. Others argue life quietly returned to smoldering ruins. You wander through a burned-out marketplace where delicate brass lamps lie half-melted among scorched cedar beams. You can almost hear the echo of merchants shouting prices over pyramids of spices: saffron, cinnamon, pepper. The scent of exotic goods once floated thick as incense through these lanes. If you ever want to drop an unexpected history bomb into conversation, try. Historians still argue whether burning your own capital city is brilliant strategy or just the world's worst insurance scam. That'll definitely raise some eyebrows. The fire rages on around you, casting the city in shifting gold and red. You can't help thinking how quickly a thriving civilization can vanish, not through enemy swords, but by its own desperate hand. And as the smoke drifts upward into the stars, you whisper a quiet farewell to Fustat, a city that once commanded empires, now buried beneath the ashes of its own fiery night. The heat and flames of Fustat's burning fade into cool turquoise ripples. Sunlight dances across your face, fractured into 1,000 shifting beams, as if the sea itself has decided to weave a mosaic of light and color just for you. Welcome to Pavlopetri. You hover weightless, the water cool against your skin as a gentle current tugs at your hair. Below you lies a ghost city resting peacefully on the seabed, a perfect grid of streets, buildings, courtyards, and tombs, all gently carpeted in seagrass and soft sand. Historians still argue whether Pavlopetri was purely a trading port, a residential city, or some hybrid of both. The mainstream fact is this: Pavlopetri is the oldest known submerged city in the world, dating back to at least 2800 BC and possibly earlier, lying just off the southern coast of Laconia, Greece. And here's a quirky tidbit. When marine archaeologists first mapped Pavlopetri in detail, they discovered it had a remarkably modern urban layout, complete with roads and rectangular plots, like the world's oldest underwater city planning committee. You swim lower, your fingertips brushing ancient stone walls. Fish dart through doorways as though guarding the secrets of millennia. Sunlight pierces the water in golden shafts, revealing narrow lanes paved in limestone. Pottery shards lie scattered like breadcrumbs, each piece hinting at lost trade networks and daily life. It's eerie how perfectly preserved it all seems. Streets, chambers, even remnants of household goods remain visible under a thin layer of sand. You imagine children running through doorways, merchants weighing goods, and families gathering in courtyards, oblivious to the fate that would eventually send their city beneath the waves. Historians still argue whether Pavlopetri vanished due to earthquakes, rising sea levels, or both. Some researchers believe tectonic activity dropped entire blocks of land into the sea, instantly flooding homes and marketplaces. Others propose a slower, relentless rise of the ocean that gradually forced people to abandon the city. You drift over an ancient workshop where amphorae once stood, ready to hold oil, wine, or grains, bound for distant shores. The air bubbles from your breath shimmer upward, catching flashes of terracotta hidden among stones. And here's something amusingly modern. Researchers have used underwater robots and 3D scanning technology to map Pavlopetri in stunning detail. So even in the digital age, we're still digitally creeping through ancient cities. We're just wetter while doing it. As you glide past a sunken plaza, you picture civic gatherings under linen awnings. The murmur of deals struck, prayers offered to unseen gods. The sea has preserved these streets so well that some walls still stand waist-high, forming neat corridors through which fish now patrol like tiny sentinels. Historians still argue whether the city's people were Minoans, Mycenaeans, or an even earlier culture. The artifacts hint at connections to Crete, Egypt, and the wider Mediterranean world. A reminder that global trade was very much a thing long before modern shipping containers. If you want to drop a fun conversation piece, casually announce, historians still argue whether Pavlopetri's harbor once held ships bound for Knossos and the Egyptian Delta. It's guaranteed to either start a lively debate or cause folks to blink and change the subject to sports. Floating above the city, you marvel at how time has stopped here beneath the waves. While storms rage above, Pavlopetri slumbers below, its streets undisturbed for thousands of years. And as you slowly rise toward the sunlit surface, you can't help wondering how many other cities lie hidden under ocean waves, waiting for curious swimmers or dreamers like you to discover them again. The cool hush of submerged Pavlopetri evaporates into blistering heat and dry wind. Sand whips past your face in gritty gusts, stinging your cheeks and filling your mouth with the sharp taste of sun-baked dust. The horizon shimmers like molten gold under a blazing Arabian sky. Welcome to Ubar, sometimes called the Atlantis of the Sands. You stand atop a dune so high, it feels like the crest of a frozen wave. Below stretches an ocean of rippling sand dunes, constantly shifting, swallowing anything left unattended for too long. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath tons of drifting sand, may lie the lost city known as Iram of the Pillars. A place both whispered about in ancient texts and hunted obsessively by modern explorers. Historians still argue whether Ubar was ever a true city, a region full of desert settlements, or purely a legend spun from traders' tales and religious texts. The mainstream fact is this: the Quran mentions Iram, a city of towering pillars destroyed by divine wrath. Over centuries, the name became tied to a fabulous desert city, supposedly buried by a sandstorm. And here's a quirky tidbit. In the early 1990s, NASA's satellite radar spotted ancient caravan routes crisscrossing the empty quarter desert, leading to a collapsed underground limestone chamber near the village of Shisar in Oman. Some declared it the remains of Ubar, a discovery hailed as the Atlantis of Arabia. You trudge down the dune, boots sinking into shifting sands. The wind sings across the ridges, carrying whispers of merchants and camels plodding beneath starry skies. The desert seems alive, as if it's hiding secrets just under your feet. Imagine the scene centuries ago. Great caravans laden with frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silks snaking across dunes under moonlight. Traders gathered in Ubar's marketplace, exchanging goods destined for Rome, India, or China. The city's towers rose above the sands like ivory tusks, gleaming in the dawn. Historians still argue whether those towers were real architectural wonders or poetic metaphors for wealth and power. Some believe Ubar was simply a crucial trading post whose water supplies collapsed when the limestone caves beneath it caved in, leaving the desert to consume it whole. You crouch beside the edge of a deep sinkhole. Loose sand trickles downward, vanishing into darkness. It's chilling to realize that entire streets might lie down there, perfectly preserved, waiting for archaeologists brave enough or reckless enough to rappel in. And here's a modern aside. Satellite archaeology has become so advanced that historians now track lost cities by spotting faint lines in desert images. the echoes of caravan paths worn into the earth over millennia. Essentially, Google Earth has turned into the ultimate treasure map. You walk onward, your cloak snapping in the hot wind. The sun blazes overhead, bleaching the dunes into shifting waves of gold and white. Your footprints vanish behind you almost as soon as you make them. If you want to sound mysterious at a party, try this. Historians still argue whether Ubar's fate was divine punishment, a natural disaster, or simply a trade route shifting away. People will either lean in closer or check to see if you're secretly auditioning for an Indiana Jones reboot. Despite decades of digging, the full story remains elusive. Was Ubar a real metropolis, a collection of oases, or just the desert's greatest illusion? Historians still argue, and the debate only deepens the city's allure. You pause at the crest of another dune, scanning the horizon. Mirage pools ripple in the distance, and the wind hisses secrets through dry grass. Somewhere beneath these sands might lie a lost city waiting to be unearthed. A city whose name has drifted through centuries, like incense on the desert breeze. And as the sun begins to slip toward the horizon, the dunes glow rose and copper under a sky turning indigo. You taste salt on your lips, and the silence around you feels impossibly deep. A silence that might yet be hiding the pillars of Iram, waiting for someone like you to find them. The blazing dunes of Ubar slip away, and a cooler wind brushes your face as you find yourself standing beneath towering arches that seem to glow like pale honey under a soft desert sun. The horizon stretches flat and endless, broken only by ancient walls rising above the plain like the ribs of some long-buried beast. Welcome to Hatra. You step forward carefully, boots crunching on stone dust as echoes bounce off massive walls. Pigeons flutter out of hidden nooks high above you, their wings clapping like faint applause for a performance long since ended. Historians still argue whether Hatra's strategic brilliance as a fortress city was its salvation or its ultimate doom. The mainstream fact is this: Hatra was founded in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE and flourished as a wealthy caravan city and religious center, resisting invasions from mighty empires like Rome and Persia until it finally fell around 241 CE to the Sasanian king Shapur I. And here's a quirky tidbit. Hatra's citizens built temples to both Mesopotamian gods and Greco-Roman deities. The city was basically an ancient interfaith community center, minus the coffee bar. You pass under one of Hatra's signature arches, monumental gateways adorned with intricate carvings of floral patterns and mythical creatures. The air smells of dry stone, faint dust, and the ghosts of forgotten chants. Imagine the city in its prime. Golden domes shimmering in the sun, processions of priests in flowing robes, merchants unloading silk and spices from camel caravans. Above the bustling streets rose colossal walls, nearly 12 meters thick in some places, encircling the city like a stone embrace. Historians still argue whether Hatra's stunning architecture influenced later Islamic designs, especially its horseshoe arches and massive domes. Some scholars trace the aesthetic lineage directly from Hatra's temples to the mosques of Baghdad and Damascus. You step into the great temple courtyard, where towering columns stand as though frozen mid-dance. Birds nest in the hollows, where statues once gazed solemnly upon worshippers. The walls loom high, catching the shifting light in patterns of gold and shadow. And here's a modern twist. Hatra earned UNESCO World Heritage status for its unique blend of Eastern and Western architectural styles. But in recent years, conflict has damaged parts of this magnificent site, leaving historians and archaeologists scrambling to preserve what remains. You brush your fingers across stone carvings of rosettes and winged figures. The rock feels warm from the sun, but carries an undercurrent of sorrow. It's as if the stones themselves remember the roar of siege engines battering the gates, the clash of swords in narrow alleys. If you ever want to surprise someone at dinner, casually announce. Historians still argue whether Hatra's final betrayal came from inside its walls, or whether it simply could not withstand the full might of Shapur's army. Instant intrigue, or awkward silence. As you wander through empty corridors, whispers seem to drift along the walls, telling tales of kings crowned under vaulted ceilings and sacrifices offered to distant gods. One of Hatra's greatest defenses was psychological. The city's reputation for magical protection was so strong that invading Roman emperors believed Hatra's priests could call down curses to doom enemy armies. Imagine facing an opponent who fights you with both spears and supernatural Yelp reviews. Historians still argue whether these stories of magical defenses were mere propaganda or rooted in genuine belief. Whatever the truth, Hatra endured siege after siege, until at last it didn't. You leave the great arches behind, stepping into sunlight blazing across sand-colored bricks. The silence here feels almost sacred, disturbed only by the rustle of wind weaving through the ruins. And as you look back at Hatra's towering walls, half shattered yet still defiant, you can't help wondering how many other forgotten citadels lie hidden beyond the horizon, waiting to tell their stories to travelers brave or curious enough to listen. Enough. The desert hush of Hatra recedes, replaced by cool, green light filtering through water. You feel weightless again, suspended in liquid silence, as a gentle current pushes you forward. Tiny bubbles drift past your face like scattered pearls. Welcome to Thonis-Heracleion. Below you, enormous columns rise from the seafloor, half buried in rippling sand. Seaweed drapes over carved hieroglyphs, swaying gently as if ancient gods are whispering secrets through the fronds. Fish flash silver among fallen statues, darting through arches that once framed grand entrances. Historians still argue whether Thonis and Heracleion were two separate cities or simply different names for the same sprawling port. The mainstream fact is this. Thonis-Heracleion was a thriving Egyptian metropolis near the Nile Delta, serving as a crucial trading hub and religious center before it dramatically slipped beneath the waves around the 2nd or 3rd century BCE. And here's a quirky tidbit. For centuries, Heracleion was known only from Greek texts and temple inscriptions. People assumed it was just another legend until divers rediscovered the city in 2000, buried under mud and sea near modern-day Alexandria. You swim lower, your hands brushing over lotus-topped columns rising from the sand. The water glows turquoise around you, illuminated by shafts of sunlight that pierce the surface like golden spears. Imagine the city in its prime. Priests chanting hymns inside massive temples. Traders unloading ships brimming with oil, grain, gold, and incense. Bright sails filled the harbor, while statues of gods towered above bustling quays. Historians still argue whether the city's catastrophic sinking resulted from a single earthquake and liquefaction event or from gradual subsidence caused by waterlogged soil. Some believe rising sea levels and the shifting Nile contributed, as if the river itself decided to rearrange history. You pass a colossal statue of the god Hapi, arms folded, a serene smile frozen in stone. His surface is coated in algae, yet his presence feels as regal as any pharaoh's. Nearby, broken stelae lie strewn across the seafloor, their hieroglyphs half erased by centuries of silt and salt. And here's something modern and mind-blowing. Underwater archaeologists have recovered more than 60 shipwrecks from the Thonis-Heracleion site. It's essentially an entire ancient marina preserved in brackish water, a nautical time capsule. You swim into a sunken temple courtyard where fallen walls lie in ordered heaps, like carefully placed dominoes toppled by unseen hands. Coral sprouts from hieroglyphs. Schools of fish ripple past you in synchronized waves. Historians still argue whether Thonis-Heracleion was politically independent or functioned merely as an extension of Alexandria's growing influence. Some inscriptions hint at tax collections and temple donations that suggest significant economic clout. You gently lift a small pottery shard from the sand. Faint patterns of lotus flowers still trace its curve, delicate despite centuries underwater. If you want to drop a conversation bomb, try saying, historians still argue whether Cleopatra herself sailed through Thonis-Heracleion's canals, guaranteed to spark curiosity, or prompt someone to spit out their coffee in surprise. Floating above the ruins, you feel caught between worlds, present and past, air and water, myth and reality. It's surreal how entire streets, colonnades, and temples lie hidden beneath waves where modern ships pass unaware overhead. And as you slowly rise toward the sunlit surface, you look down one last time at Thonis-Heracleion's submerged avenues. Columns sway gently under the pull of the tide, guarding their secrets in silence. And you wonder how many other cities lie quietly sleeping beneath the sea, waiting for a diver or a dreamer like you to awaken them once more. The shimmering waters of Thonis-Heracleion drain away, leaving you blinking in fierce sunlight. The sky above is an immaculate, cloudless blue, and warm wind rustles through scrubby grass. You find yourself standing at the crossroads of a city so geometrically perfect that even modern urban planners might blush in admiration. Welcome to Timgad. Under your feet stretches an intricate network of stone streets, so straight and precise they look drawn by a ruler. Everywhere you turn, right angles snap into view. It's like wandering through a blueprint brought to life. Historians still argue whether Timgad was built mainly as a military colony for retired Roman soldiers, or as a showcase of Roman urban design to impress the locals. The mainstream fact is this: founded around 100 CE by Emperor Trajan, Timgad was one of the Roman Empire's best-planned cities, boasting a perfect grid layout, forums, baths, libraries, and temples. And here's a quirky tidbit. Timgad's streets are aligned so precisely that on the day of the autumn equinox, the rising sun shines directly down the city's main street, the Decumanus Maximus, as if the Romans wanted their city to double as a giant solar calendar. You stroll forward along the Decumanus, your footsteps echoing softly on giant paving stones. Grass pokes up between cracks, waving lazily in the breeze. Fluted columns stand in silent ranks along the avenue, casting long, elegant shadows. It's strangely serene, this orderly silence. You can almost hear the chatter of citizens in togas bargaining for olives, fresh bread, and amphorae of wine. Bustling markets once filled these streets, while senators and merchants debated politics in sunlit forums. Historians still argue whether Timgad's population ever reached its projected capacity of 15,000 to 20,000 residents. Some believe the city never quite filled to its intended limits, remaining half empty even during Rome's peak. As you reach the Forum, you pause beside a triumphal arch dedicated to Emperor Trajan. Carved Latin inscriptions glow faintly under the sunlight. Birds flutter overhead, nesting among the entablatures where once grand statues gazed over busy plazas. And here's something delightfully modern. Archaeologists discovered graffiti scrawled into Timgad's walls in Latin. One famous example reads, Venari, lavare, ludere, ridere, hoc est vivere. Translation, to hunt, to bathe, to play, to laugh, that is to live. Proof that even ancient Romans were big on work-life balance. You duck into the remains of the library, a building so well planned that scholars today can still see where scrolls were stored in stone niches. The air smells of dry stone and sun-warmed dust. You imagine scholars huddled over parchment, debating philosophy and law, perhaps occasionally doodling questionable art in the margins. Historians still argue whether Timgad's decline began due to desert encroachment, shifting trade routes, or invasions from Berber tribes. Eventually, the sands rolled in, and the perfect grid vanished beneath a golden tide. You wander through quiet bathhouses where mosaic floors depict sea creatures twisting in bright tiles. Echoes bounce off marble walls, as if ancient bathers might reappear at any moment, towels in hand, discussing the latest Senate gossip. If you want to impress someone at a party, drop this line. Historians still argue whether Timgad's urban plan was Rome's finest city design, or simply a textbook model rarely achieved elsewhere. Cue thoughtful nods, or frantic Google searches. You step back out into the sun. The wind whistles along the decumanus, weaving through arches and fallen stones. From above, Timgad's streets still form a perfect grid, a forgotten geometry etched into North Africa's dusty plains. And as you look down those sunlit avenues, you wonder how a city so precisely built could slip so completely into silence, leaving only its stony grid to mark where life once thrived. The precise streets of Timgad fade into swirling desert winds. The air grows hotter, shimmering above endless sand dunes stretching to the horizon. You feel a quiet hush settle over the landscape, a hush broken only by the distant cry of a desert hawk circling high overhead. Welcome to the pyramids, but not the ones you're thinking of. You're gliding above lonely monuments rising from the desert, far from the tourist crowds of Giza. These are Egypt's forgotten pyramids, some graceful, some half-collapsed, all guardians of secrets waiting in the sand. Historians still argue whether these lesser-known pyramids fell into obscurity purely because of later pharaohs overshadowing their builders, or whether natural disasters and shifting political centers doomed them to anonymity. The mainstream fact is this: beyond Giza lie dozens of pyramids scattered along the Nile Valley and into Sudan, each with its own mysteries and royal ghosts. And here's a quirky tidbit. The so-called bent pyramid at Dashur changes its angle halfway up because builders panicked mid-construction. Apparently, even the ancient Egyptians had bad days at work. You soar over Dashur, where the bent pyramid angles outward like a stone trying to shrug its shoulders. Its limestone casing still gleams pale gold under the sun. Nearby stands the Red Pyramid, the first successful true pyramid built by Pharaoh Sneferu. The desert around you whispers of older dynasties. Broken capstones lie half buried in dunes, inscriptions worn faint by centuries of wind. You drift towards Saqqara, where the step pyramid of Djoser rises in stacked terraces like a giant stone wedding cake. Historians still argue whether Djoser's step pyramid was purely a tomb, or also a monument designed to showcase his divine power. Some believe it was both, a blend of afterlife architecture and royal propaganda. At Saqqara, you hover above mastabas, flat-roofed tombs with painted walls depicting feasts, music, and everyday life. You can almost hear flutes and laughter echoing from the stone corridors below. Further south in Sudan, the desert conceals another pyramid field, the royal necropolis of Meroe. Here, slender, steep-sided pyramids rise in clusters, built by the kings and queens of the Kushite Empire. The architecture echoes Egyptian styles, yet stands uniquely Nubian. Historians still argue whether these Nubian rulers saw themselves as heirs to the pharaohs, or as entirely distinct kings in their own right. You drift closer to one of Meroe's pyramids, its sandstone blocks glowing orange in the afternoon sun. The top is missing, a result of 19th century treasure hunters who blew off pyramid caps with dynamite. Because apparently nothing says archaeology like controlled explosions. And here's something modern and mind-bending. Radar surveys continue to reveal hidden chambers beneath these lesser-known pyramids. Archaeologists suspect entire buried complexes remain undiscovered, waiting beneath untouched dunes. You hover above the desert floor, where shifting sands expose fragments of painted reliefs. Pharaohs stride across stone panels, wearing crowns adorned with cobras, holding staffs of power. Nearby, hieroglyphs hint at names now lost to history. If you want to drop a fun fact into conversation, try this. Historians still argue whether the bent pyramid's odd angle was a deliberate symbolic gesture or just ancient engineering panic. You'll either impress people or send them scrambling for their phones. You glide onward, leaving behind a trail of drifting sand. The pyramids shrink into the distance, half swallowed by the desert that both preserves and erases them. And as you look back at these silent monuments, you wonder how many kings once stood here, gazing over the same sands, never imagining their names might someday vanish into history's forgotten pages. The winds of Egypt soften and fade. Sunlight dims and the air cools into gentle twilight. You find yourself standing on an endless plain, a place not marked on any map, where the horizon stretches in every direction beneath a darkening sky. This is where forgotten cities linger, and where cities yet undiscovered still sleep. You stand perfectly still, listening. The ground beneath your feet thrums, as though 1,000 silent stories wait just below the surface. The stars blink overhead, their cold light glittering like distant watchfires across time. Historians still argue whether we've even scratched the surface of all humanity's hidden past. The mainstream fact is this. Every year, new technologies like LiDAR and satellite scanning reveal entire city grids buried under jungle canopies, deserts, and river deltas. Places once thought empty turn out to be rich with lost architecture, roads, and civilizations. And here's a quirky tidbit. In 2016, archaeologists scanning Cambodia's jungles discovered vast urban networks hidden beneath Angkor Wat, cities larger than Manhattan that nobody had physically seen for centuries. It's as if the earth occasionally winks at us and whispers, "Guess what else I'm hiding?" You close your eyes and imagine a jungle somewhere in South America. A single drone passes overhead, its laser pulses cutting through leafy canopies. Below, temples appear on the screen, pyramids, plazas, networks of roads all glowing green under digital light. Historians still argue whether the Amazon was once home to millions in complex city-states, their buildings swallowed by vines after European contact. Then you picture the Sahara, shifting dunes concealing in ancient walls and stone inscriptions waiting to surface after the next sandstorm. Or the seabed off India's western coast, where divers found ruins hinting at harbors and temples now lost beneath the Arabian Sea. If you ever want to captivate someone, say, historians still argue whether we've already walked above undiscovered cities, their stones hidden just inches beneath our feet. That's the perfect way to make even a routine hike feel like an expedition. You imagine corridors echoing with forgotten footsteps, staircases winding downward into rooms untouched for millennia. A breeze brushes your hair, carrying faint scents of damp earth, salt water, and ancient stone. The more you learn about history, the clearer it becomes. The world is full of secrets. Cities lie beneath jungles, under rivers, under seas. There are towers hidden by moss, streets paved and forgotten, temples lost under layers of volcanic ash. Historians still argue whether our best discoveries are already behind us, or waiting just around the next bend. And here's a modern thought to keep you dreaming. Right now, scientists are working on AI tools to sift through satellite data and find the faint outlines of entire civilizations. Who knows? Maybe one day your name will appear in the credits of a new history documentary because you spotted a suspicious square shape in Google Earth. You stand quietly under the stars. Somewhere out there, hidden under leaf litter, under dunes, or beneath the waves, a city waits. Its stones are cool and silent, but they hold warmth from human lives lived long ago. And as your eyes grow heavy, you realize you're not merely listening to history. You're becoming part of it. A traveler moving through forgotten streets, dreaming of cities that might yet rise again into the sunlight. Your feet feel lighter now, as though the earth has decided to let you go, gently lifting the weight of forgotten empires from your shoulders. The air grows softer, each breath filling your lungs with the cool hush of starlight. You drift backward through every city we've visited tonight, from Petra's rosy walls to Atlantis shimmering beneath the waves, from the dense jungles of Palenque to the wind-swept sands of Ubar. Each place leaves behind a small echo, like a quiet note hanging in the dark. Slowly, your steps slow. The colors fade into softer hues, gold into silver, crimson into dusty lavender. Your pulse matches the rhythm of distant waves, the whisper of leaves in a hidden jungle, the soft fall of sand over forgotten bricks. There's comfort in knowing that the world is vast and ancient, full of secrets waiting patiently for curious eyes and gentle hearts. That you're part of a story written over thousands of years. That even in silence, these lost cities breathe. So let your eyelids fall, heavy and warm. Feel the cool breeze drift over your face, carrying faint fragrances of incense, rain-washed stone, and desert air. Let your mind wander through hidden corridors, silent plazas, and sunken archways where only the stars know your name. Thank you for wandering these forgotten worlds with me tonight. Sweet dreams.